Okay, so this is be a quick overview of our first lab unit, first lab stuff that we'll be going over for the summer session here. Typically, of course, obviously we do these in person, so the experience will probably be a little bit different from that standpoint, but I feel that by utilizing the images here, at least you're getting a similar type of experience in terms of viewing the things that you would be viewing in person, with your hands and holding things, and that type of experience, of course, won't be exactly the same. So we want to try to replicate that somewhat. So the objective of this video that I'm going to share with you, or this overview, is really just to help you understand exactly kind of what to look for, how I'm going to be testing you, sort of how to prepare for this lab unit. And I'll have one of these for each of the lab sessions sort of going forward. All right, so let's go ahead and get started on this first one. Primarily three categories of material that you want to be able to identify. The first is terminology, meaning just understanding anatomical terms and being able to provide, definitions and meanings for that. So I'll go over that. Then we're going to look at all the different organs and organ systems. You want to be able to visually identify all the organs that are sort of specifically outlined in this lab unit. And then histology would be the other significant portion of that, which is histology is the study of tissue. So I just want to go through each slide, slide by slide, so you can have a feel for how this is going to go this summer. All right, so first is terminology, and there's different types of terms. I like to say in the beginning of the semester is that, a lot of these terms you understand just from a everyday language, like everyone knows their front and their back and their top and bottom, etc. But what you may, or your elbow or your back of your knee, you could explain where all those things are, obviously, but in this course, you'll be learning anatomical terms for those things. So for instance, as you can see on directional terminology, the anatomical term for the front, referencing the front of the body, would be anterior or ventral, either one. And the anatomical term for the back, of course, posterior. I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with that, but dorsal may be a term you're not quite as familiar with. So anyway, as with all of these terms you're going to see in this first section of slides, you want to be able to sort of go either way with the term. So in other words, if I ask you, on an exam, if I have the term back and I say, give me the anatomical term for that, you would say posterior or dorsal. Vice versa, if I had, written on the exam, posterior or dorsal, and give me the everyday term for that, you would write back, of course. So you want to be able to go either direction. And I think most of these are pretty straightforward, above and below, superior and inferior, of course. Medial and lateral, they're usually typically sort of mixed in terms of people's familiarity with that. Essentially, medial and lateral just refers to the midline of the body. Midline of the body is, just like we said, right down the center. So if you're just sort of drawing a plumb line right down the middle of the body, that would be the midline. And as you can see in this image that I've included here, I won't be using this image on the exam, but if that helps you visualize what we mean by these terms, you can see the arrow they're pointing here is that moving toward the midline is medial, and moving away from the midline is lateral. So, for instance, one thing you may come across when you see these terms would be talking about muscle actions, for instance, like rotator cuff muscles. Some move the shoulder medially and some rotate the shoulder laterally, right? So toward the midline or away from the midline. So again, you want to be able to use that, understand that. Another one is proximal and distal. essentially, it's just term either referencing the attached base, and proximally is either toward or near the attached base, and distal is further away from the attached base. So an example of how this might be used typically would be you could reference, say, the wrist and the elbow. You could say, for instance, the wrist is distal to the elbow, right? Because the wrist is further away from the attached base than the elbow is. So the counter to that would be the elbow would be proximal to the wrist, right? Because the elbow is closer to the attached base, meaning sort of like your core, than your wrist would be. So proximal and distal. So you might want to play with some of those, practice some of those. There are some good examples throughout your textbook that I would encourage you to utilize as well for proximal and distal. Superficial, deep, right and left, of course, I think most people know those. I think those are pretty self-explanatory. So again, what I've tried to do throughout these labs is include images, as I said, to kind of help you identify. But what I will specifically be testing you on in this case are the things in the boxes. So you need to know all of the items within this box I will be testing you on from a terminology standpoint. All right, so that's the first slide. Next, we have planes and sections, and the human body, as you can see in the slide, is a three-dimensional object, and this is significant mostly from an imaging standpoint, being able to identify sections, but even in our textbook, when we try to look inside the body, we'll be slicing things up in different ways to see inside these different sections. And so essentially there are three different planes or sections that you want to be able to identify. So transverse or horizontal divides the body into superior and inferior portions, right? So as you can see in this picture, this would be the transverse plane or section. And as I said, you'll see these types of sections as we go throughout the semester and look through the textbook. But again, as I said, this is something that's done with like MRIs and X-rays and CT scans and things like that, where we can see inside the body and use these different sections to look at different organs or different regions of the body. So transverse or horizontal is one. Frontal or coronal divides the body into anterior and posterior sections, and then the sagittal divides the body into left and right. So it sort of goes essentially through that central midline section that I was mentioning. But you can have a sagittal section on that plane. It doesn't necessarily have to be right in the midline. So the point for you, again, is to identify these or be able to understand the significance and the terms related with these different planes and sections. So that would be another component you want to have. Then we have a lot of anatomical adjectives. And I was saying before, like, of course, you all know where the ear is or the nose is or the cheek, etc. But now we'll be using an anatomical term to describe those regions. Instead of saying the head, now we're saying cephalic. Instead of saying the ear, we're saying otic. Instead of saying the neck, we're saying cervical. Instead of saying the lower back, we're saying lumbar, etc. So as I said before, you want to be able to identify all of these different components in these different boxes and go either way. So if I give you the term ear, you have to be able to write otic on your answer. And vice versa. If I wrote otic, you'd have to give me the everyday term ear. So go either way with these terms. They should be pretty straightforward from that standpoint, from these anatomical adjectives. There's another page of them here with arms and hands and feet. So you want to make sure you have all of these different terms and be familiar with those. So again, I think you pretty much know, where the anterior elbow is, for instance. But now instead of saying anterior elbow, you would say antecubital from that standpoint. So just a good opportunity to sort of get the foundation of terms for this course going forward, because again, we'll be using these terms throughout the semester. And as I know, most of you are probably hoping to go to nursing school or OT or PT. you're going to want to become well versed in these terms and just use them sort of almost as second nature. So this is a good opportunity to learn those terms at the beginning of the semester. All right, so I've also included a visual here. I won't be using this particular visual on the exam, but again, it can help you sort of visualize what exactly we're talking about. It's a good way to practice too. For instance, if you can, maybe print off the slide and cover up all of the different answers, and then you can just fill in the answers where the arrows go. It might be a good way to sort of practice or test yourself. 3x5 cards is also something that I think is really effective. I know that's very old school in terms of study. It's not like Quizlet or something else. But you could write, cervical on one side of the card, flip it over, write neck on the back. And not only does that give you an easy way to practice and review, but the actual process of sort of putting pen to paper to make those cards, I feel really is an effective way to connect with the material that you're learning. So I feel like doing these 3x5 cards, really throughout all this material, especially with the lab stuff, is a really effective way to learn it, but then also to get a really easy way to practice and sort of test yourself on this material. All right, so that's it on all the terminology. Hopefully that's pretty straightforward. Next thing you want to understand are the body cavities. And the body cavities are essentially, where we have vital organs. And so you have a dorsal body cavity and you have a ventral body cavity. If you learned from your previous slides, you know what dorsal and ventral means, right? Dorsal means posterior or back, right? Ventral means anterior or front. And so that's exactly what it is. Dorsal cavity is basically housing your brain and spinal cord, so that dorsal cavity can be subdivided into the cranial and spinal cavity. And then the ventral cavity is essentially two cavities separated by the diaphragm. So the diaphragm, we'll talk more about that in A&P2 and do digestion and respiration, mostly respiration. The ventral cavity subdivided into thoracic and abdominal pelvic. And what's important about this is not only understanding these different cavities, and this will be discussed in the lecture, in the intro chapter of the lecture as well. You'll learn about the different cavities within the thoracic cavity, like the pericardial cavity, which sort of covers the organ itself, but also there's a little space within the cavity. And so for the heart and for the lungs, and then you have what's called the mediastinum, which is just sort of a space that houses like the esophagus and the trachea that ultimately work their way down into the lower abdominal pelvic cavity, at least some of those components. So you want to be able to understand not only the different cavities, but where, which organs reside in these different cavities. So for instance, you need to know that the brain is in the cranial cavity, which is in the dorsal cavity. And for instance, you need to know the heart is in the pericardial cavity, which is, of course, within the thoracic cavity. So it's sort of like a layering, understanding which cavities they belong to and which organs reside in these very specific cavities. For instance, the abdominal pelvic cavity, understanding the abdominal cavity, of course, what organs reside there? Oh, the stomach, liver, gallbladder, pancreas, so forth and so on. So definitely want to have all this information related to body cavities, not only understanding the chambers, right, these cavities, but also which organs belong to which cavity or chamber. All right. All right. So that is information on body cavities. This is a little bit more information regarding serous membranes. We'll go over this a little bit more in lecture as well, in the intro chapter and lecture. But essentially, a serous membrane is a thin, simple squamous epithelial membrane that covers the organ itself, but also covers the cavity wall. And that's kind of what they're representing in this picture with the heart, is that you have a visceral layer of this serous membrane that covers the organ. So for instance, you have a visceral pericardium, but you also have a layer of the serous membrane that covers the cavity wall, which we call the parietal layer. So that's important to understand because this is found in the pleural and pericardial and peritoneal cavities in the abdominal pelvic cavity. So definitely want to understand serous membranes and sort of what we mean by these different serous membranes that line these different organs and body cavities. So that's an important slide to have. All right, next thing we have are organs and organ systems. And so this, again, I sort of categorize this as just really good foundational information that you're going to need going forward throughout this course and your future courses related to nursing and OT and EMT and all these different programs you guys want to do. So this is just a really foundational, important slide to have. So you want to know all the different organ systems. We're going to talk more about this in lecture. It's really how this course is built up. On organ system, we do roughly half of the body's organ systems in A&P1, the other half of the body's organ systems in A&P2. And at this time, I want you to know all 11 organ systems. So as you can see, they're listed on the slide. And then I also want you to know, all of the organs that fall within that organ system. In bold, like the brain and the spinal cord, for instance, you need to be able to visually identify those on the exam and also tell me either which organ system they belong to or which body cavity, as we just described in the previous slide. So I want to be able to have a visual, being able to visually identify these different organs. I've shown in the slides that are coming up, I've included more details about all the organ systems and some pictures, but you may want to go through your textbook to identify, to have some other pictures if you're not, if you want a larger image so that you can definitely identify, for instance, the adrenal gland or the kidney or the thyroid gland, in terms of what they really look like. You may want to go through your textbook a little bit to find some images of those. But again, I've included those larger, just general images in the slides that we'll be following. All right, so anyway, so you need to understand all of these different organ systems, different organs, which body cavity they belong to, et cetera, et cetera. All right, and then as I said, these are all the pictures. So you want to have all this information, and again, just having a general understanding of function is also very important and foundational as we'll be going through this throughout all of these courses and beyond for you guys. All right, so and so I've included just sort of an overview and picture of all these different organs and organ systems on these slides. So you can utilize these pictures, but again, you may want to sort of review through your textbook and find some other more detailed photos so you can visually identify them on the lab practical. All right. All right, so here's the endocrine system, cardiovascular, lymphatic. The spleen is the primary one of the lymphatic that I would have you identify, and you can see the spleen is right here. Respiratory, trachea, and lungs. You want to make sure you can review those and identify those, but you can see them on this picture here. Digestive, there are quite a few organs: esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. So you want to make sure you can visually identify those. The pancreas is both a digestive organ, but it's also an endocrine organ. So you'll see that in the endocrine system, but you also see it listed here in the digestive system. So make sure you can identify all those different structures listed in bold visually. Kidneys, you can see the kidneys are look like a kidney bean, right? They're major part of urinary function and urine production are found in the kidneys. So you want to make sure you can visually identify those. And then we have the reproductive organs. We'll go over the male and female reproductive organs in terms of visual identifications and other specifics in A&P2. But for now, again, just have the general information on these slides, and you should be good on that. All right, so that up to this point, up to histology, which is going to be this last portion of this first lab unit, I would say the part that I just went over is probably going to be roughly half of the first lab practical exam. And the histology that I'm going to go over now will be the rest of the, make up the rest of the lab practical. So typically the lab exams have about 50 questions on them, so you can count on roughly 25 or so from this terminology and organs and organ systems and body cavities, and then another 25 or so based on histology. So let's go ahead and run through the histology then. The histology is the study of tissues. We're going to be learning again more about this in lecture, on the lecture slides, but you want to understand what that means. Well, tissue is a group of cells. So we're not going to be looking at individual cells. We want to look at a collection of cells. You know, what do these collection of cells do? And that's what a tissue is, and histology is the study then of tissues. So you need a microscope to really see these tissues in great detail. So of course that's something we won't be doing here, but I've included images of all these tissues, and that's how I'll be testing you. I'll be showing you an actual tissue sample that's listed here in the lab manual, and then I'll have you identify, what type of tissue it is, and then I'll give me a function of that. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing in this next section of this first lab unit. So, as we'll see, again, we do a whole chapter on histology and lecture, and as you'll see from studying those lectures, that there are 4 basic tissue types: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. And within those 4 categories, there are typically several tissue types that you need to identify. So that's what we're going to look at, and we'll start with epithelial tissues. And epithelial tissues typically just have cells. They're as we'll see with connective tissues, there are lots of other things other than just cells. But with epithelial tissues, really what you're looking for in terms of identifying are cells. And what you're going to help you to distinguish between them are either the number of cell layers, right? Meaning, is it one layer, is it multiple layers? And then the cell shape. Is it flat, is it cubed, is it columnar, etc. And from that, you can then identify these different tissue types. And so, as I said, within epithelial tissues, you have, within that category, you have several that you have to identify. And that's what we'll look at next. There are about 6 of these that you have to specifically identify. So the first one is what's known as simple squamous epithelium. Simple squamous means one layer of cells. Squamous is that the cells are really flat. Okay, and so that's what this picture is showing you, are, one layer of flat cells sort of lined up next to each other. And so this is a very common tissue type in the body. We see it in the alveoli of the lungs, where gas exchange occurs. We see it lining blood vessels. We see it covering the heart. We see it within the kidneys. We see it lining body cavities, that serous membrane that I was just talking about that covers different organs. That is made of simple squamous epithelium. And really what it does is it just provides a lining. We can see absorption and secretion occurring. It can reduce friction, like in the case of the serous membranes. So simple squamous is really important. So what, again, to be very clear in terms of how I'll test you on this, is that if I show you this picture on the exam, you'll need to tell me what tissue it is, which of course is simple squamous epithelium. And you also need to be able to give me one function and at least one location. So again, there are oftentimes many functions and locations for these tissues. So we'll sort of pare that down a little bit. And if you can just give me one function, one location, and be able to correctly visually identify the tissue, that's what you want to do. So to really get an overview of this, you could do, there are some great images online. Obviously, everyone does Google. You could do Google Images and see lots of different microscopic images of different sort of samples of simple squamous if you want. That would be a good way to sort of master the material. but I'll be using this image on the exam, and you have to correctly identify it and give me a function and location. So that's what you want to do basically for all of these tissue types, is be able to visually identify it correctly and also give me a function and location. All right, so that's the first of the epithelial tissues, and that is simple squamous. Next one is simple cuboidal, right? Simple, one layer, cube-shaped cells. So you go through and you can see, like, here is a nice section of cube-shaped cells. You can see it's like a little box around it with a nucleus in the middle. And that's what we have sort of for simple cuboidal epithelium. So one layer, cube-shaped cells. Don't see a whole lot of protection, but we see it in locations like the thyroid gland, kidneys, tubules, ovaries, etc., for simple cuboidal. Next is we have simple columnar, and again, I go over all these tissues in great detail in lab, or excuse me, over lecture, and so you want to apply those to this lab information and sort of helping you identify these different structures. Next is simple columnar. Simple, of course, means one layer, right? Columnar means long, columnar, rectangular shaped cells. And so we see this commonly like in the digestive pathway, so in the stomach and the intestines, gallbladder, because you need a pretty strong, tough tissue, but you also need something that can secrete and absorb pretty easily as well. Okay. All right, so that is simple columnar epithelium. One thing that's also distinctive about simple columnar epithelium is they oftentimes have microvilli across the top, which is like a thin bar across the top. But oftentimes, especially in digestive areas, you'll see what are called goblet cells. Those cells secrete mucus. But again, for our purposes, you need to visually identify it as well as give you one function and one location. All right, on to stratified squamous epithelium. Stratified squamous is, stratified means multiple layers of cells. Squamous are these flat cells. And so this section here is what we're talking about when we mean stratified squamous. It's lots of flat cells sort of stacked on top of each other, almost like plied or something, and they provide great protection, right? So like your skin, for instance, the outer layer of your skin is stratified squamous epithelium, and it's going to provide protection. So you can see the stratified squamous epithelium pretty well in this picture and see how it would really provide a lot of protection against not only abrasion, but pathogens, chemicals, things like that, because they would have to get all the way through this tissue to get all the way deep inside the body. So that's important from a protective standpoint. So that's stratified squamous epithelium. Next one is pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And pseudostratified just means falsely stratified. In other words, all cells are touching the bottom of the tissue, but not all of them are reaching the free surface. And you can see their nuclei. So they kind of look like, simple columnar that we just went over, but it's not, because it's not really stratified. So we call it pseudostratified. What's also distinctive about this tissue is that they have cilia across the top. I talk more about cilia in lecture, but cilia basically are more longer, like finger-like projections. And so this is very useful, for instance, in our nasal cavity, in our trachea, in our bronchi, to sort of keep things moving and keep the airway open. Because the cilia, again, sort of have these finger-like projections, actually have the ability to move or beat, and we call it sort of like the ciliary escalator to kind of move things along. We see that in the male and female reproductive pathways as well, to sort of move. For instance, in the male reproductive pathway, before sperm can actually have the ability to move with their corkscrew flagellum tail, they have to move through the reproductive pathway in some way, and part of that is done with the sort of movement of these cilia in that pathway. So that's pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And And last one of the epithelials are transitional. Transitional is one that, just like it says, can transition, can change shape. So for instance, we see this lining the urinary bladder. And this picture is in a recoiled position, but as the lumen fills, like for instance with urine, right, it would stretch out and then of course recoil back into position. So permitting expansion of recoil is a very important function of this transitional epithelium. So you can see that in that slide there. So anyway, so those are our 6 epithelials. So again, you'll be able to identify those, give me a function and location, and you can move on to the next. And again, you want to apply what you're learning in the lecture slides to the lab materials. That's why we sort of coordinate the information that we do in lecture, sort of overlaps at least somewhat with what we're doing in lab. All right, next are connective tissues. And connective tissues, again, I'll go over this in great detail in the lectures, but the connective tissues are really abundant tissue in the body, sort of holding things together, protect, support other tissues. But what's really distinctive about them from a visual standpoint is that, unlike we saw with epithelial cells, right? Epithelial was just cells. That's all we were looking for. Were they cube? Were they columnar? Here we're looking at lots of other things than just cells, what we call extracellular materials. And oftentimes in these connective tissues, extracellular materials make up the majority of what we'll be looking at. All right, so somewhat like what we did with epithelial tissues, there are different classes of connective tissues: connective tissue proper, fluid, and supporting connective tissue. And you need to identify each individual tissue type. Of course, give me a function and location. All right, so we'll start with areolar or areolar connective tissue, which is sort of a loose connective type of tissue. We see this throughout the body. For instance, that stratified squamous epithelium that represents your skin that we just talked about, it attaches to an areolar connective tissue. So it's going to provide a lot of support and cushion for the body, but it has all sorts of things in the matrix of this areolar connective tissue, which again is gone over in great detail in lecture. Here's what it looks like though in this picture, and you can see collagen fibers, you can see elastic fibers, you can see different types of cells, you can kind of see in sort of off-white or yellowish in the background matrix. So a lot of things that you can see for this areolar connective tissue. All right. Next type is adipose tissue. And adipose tissues is made up of fat cells, basically, sort of fat cells on top of fat cells. This is what we see in our subcutaneous region, which is beneath the skin. We also see this around the kidneys, the heart, the breast, abdomen. These are all locations where we see adipose tissue, and you're just seeing essentially fat cells. And fat cells have the ability to be larger or smaller depending on the amount of lipid in each of these cells. So that's why you sort of see a variance in the sizes. Third one is dense regular connective tissue, and this is, or also referred to as collagenous tissue, and these are just collagen fibers. Collagen fibers are a type of fiber that I go over in greater detail in the lecture that make up like a tendon or a ligament, right? And so that's what we're looking at, is you're looking at collagen fibers tightly packed on top of collagen fibers. And so that's dense regular connective tissue. Next, you want to look at, there are 3 types of cartilage. You have hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. Hyaline cartilage, what's pretty typical for all of these is you can see a cell population, which are chondrocytes, and you can typically see some sort of fibers in the matrix. And so with hyaline cartilage, collagen fibers are there, you just can't see them as well, but you can see all of these cells are chondrocytes. So it kind of has a smooth appearance background made up with these collagen fibers, but then you also have these chondrocytes. And so we see hyaline cartilage, another pretty common type of tissue, connective tissue in the body. We see it in the trachea and the larynx. We also see it at the end of long bones for this hyaline cartilage. Pretty stiff, strong type of connective tissue. Next is elastic cartilage. This is what we have, like, for instance, on our external ear, right? Feel your ear and you can sort of bend it and move it around. It pops right back into place, right? Because it has elastic fibers in the matrix as well. So you can see the chondrocytes, and then the elastic fibers you can see are kind of like these, thin lines or thin ropes, probably not the right word, but you sort of can get a feel for what those look like. You can see those much clearer in the elastic cartilage matrix than you can see in the hyaline cartilage. And then the last one is fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage, you can see the fibers in the matrix really nicely if you look at this picture, but then you can also see the chondrocytes, as you could in previous tissues, or previous cartilage tissues that I showed you. This type of cartilage is, because it contains such a fibrous background matrix, we see this in the meniscus of the knee, for instance, which provides cushioning. The intervertebral discs in between our vertebrae are made of fibrocartilage, pubic symphysis as well. So these are all examples of fibrocartilage. And then the last type of connective tissue that you're responsible for is compact bone. And we'll be doing a whole chapter on bone. For now, you want to be able to see this specific slide of compact bone, which kind of looks like a tree stump, right? You have this, this whole structure is what's called an osteon, and your compact bone of, like, your femur and your humerus and these different bones we're going to be learning are all made of osteons sort of piled on top of osteons. Okay? And so that's what we're seeing in this picture here. All right, so that is it on the connective tissue. Then we want to move on to the muscle tissue. 3 types of muscle. You have skeletal, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Some of the differences that you're going to be seeing with skeletal muscle: number 1, skeletal muscle is striated. Striated means, as we'll learn later when we do muscle in great detail, is stripes, sort of like a banded or striped appearance, and it is highly organized as well. And the tissue is also what we call multinucleated. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the lecture portion. But for skeletal muscle, you'll be able to identify it visually. Give me a function, location. So function, of course, would be, generates heat or creates motion. And then location would be, bicep or tricep or whatever skeletal muscle you wanted to provide from that standpoint. Cardiac muscle also has the striations, as you can see. But as you can also see, as compared with the previous slide, it's not quite as organized, a little more branched, right, in terms of how it's organized. It also has these lines here that we call intercalated discs, which sort of adjoin different sections and different cells of these heart muscle cells. Cardiac muscle is a single nucleus, meaning it has 1 nucleus per muscle cell. But again, it's also striated and only found in the heart, so that's the only location. And it's going to pump blood, right? When it contracts, it's going to push blood throughout the body. All right, so that is cardiac muscle tissue. And the last type of muscle tissue is called smooth muscle tissue. Smooth muscle tissue is not striated, right? There are no stripes that you see in cardiac and skeletal. The nuclei are a little more oval. It's a little more consistent in terms of appearance. And we see this throughout the body, right? We see this lining blood vessels, like our arteries, for instance, have smooth muscle around them, which allows you can change the diameter of your arteries. You can dilate or constrict the vessel. It moves food and urine, right? So like our esophagus, after you swallow food, our esophagus is like a muscular tube that goes down to your stomach, and smooth muscle produces what we call peristalsis, which allows materials to move through our body. The uterus, for instance, is another organ that has significant amount of smooth muscle. That's what, when a woman is going through labor and delivery, for instance, the uterine contractions, smooth muscle contractions, are pushing the newborn through the birth canal. So these are all examples of where we see smooth muscle tissue. So you have three types. When we will distinctly identify, of course, all three different types of muscle tissue, and then give me a function and location. Last one is nervous tissue, and this is the only one slide for this. And what you're seeing on this picture is what's called a motor neuron. A motor neuron is the thing that generates electrical impulses. So, we'll learn more about how the nervous system works, but essentially what your body is doing, your central nervous system is doing, is generating these electrical impulses that communicate messages, or what we also refer to as action potentials. And so we see these neurons in the brain and the spinal cord. Now there's a whole other types of tissues in the body, in the nervous system, that are called neuroglia or glial cells that support the neurons so they can do what they want to do. But for now, we just want to be able to identify the motor neuron, which you can see in this picture. All right, so that is it for Lab Unit 1. Hopefully you have a good idea of what to expect. I'll also be posting a practice test so you can kind of have a run through of doing this exam in an online format. All right.